Welcome to State Attack. I'm Christopher Glyer.
And I'm Nick Carr.
And today we got an action-packed show for you. We're going to talk about MITRE ATT&CK, CARBANAK week recap that we had a series of blog posts about. We're going to talk about some new targeted ransomware deployments that continue happening, some new activity that we've seen from Fin7, some tools that have been leaking from a group that we call APT34, and then lastly, some of the indictments that came out from related to Anthem and some individuals in China. So I guess without further ado, we'll get started on the MITRE, right?
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about MITRE ATT&CK and varying feelings about some of it and some gaps maybe some other times, and the team's been really receptive to that feedback and working it into the community repository. So over the last month, they released an update.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of new attack techniques that Frank Duff and Katie Nichols and team all released.
It was our first time contributing to them as well.
Right.
So we got some updates in there, which has been pretty cool, and just reflects some of the interesting activity we've been seeing. So one of them, which should be pretty familiar to people on the show, is some of the Outlook persistence, expanding on the use of Ruler and all the different persistence modules that offers, forms persistence and rule persistence, and then Outlook homepage persistence, which we've talked about a good amount.
Ad nauseum, yeah.
And then we expanded that, though, with the Outlook add-in persistence as well, which was used by the Postal Door, Postal Book framework that we talked about at the Cyber Defense Summit last year. And that was pretty cool because it's just a .NET plugin, a .NET backdoor that's implemented as an Outlook add-in, and it actually embeds the beacon within email, within a PNG in the email. So you send out emails, and the beacon information is encoded in there and is updated and injected basically into a little signature line, into a little picture. So
now your signature line with some extra spice with it?
Yeah, exactly. So that was pretty interesting and cool to have that reflected and referenced. And then, what else? What else do we update?
I think there were 3 or 4, right? It was the...
the Masquerading. So they have a fairly broad definition of binary masquerading. And so we tried to update with a couple examples of renaming binaries. Specifically, we continue to see a lot of living off the land, but renaming those binaries as a form of evasion. So
copying command.exe or PowerShell or something
exactly.
to a legitimate file, and then the challenge from a defender's perspective, an attacker does that because they're not modifying the file itself; they're just renaming it. All the PE header information, so the original file name and if it's digitally signed, will all still be valid. But from a defender's perspective, if your EDR tools or other tools you have pull that information, that can be a good way from a detection perspective to say, find me all things with the original file name of PowerShell.exe.
Yeah, and depending on your environment, maybe you can actually look for certutil launching remote payloads, or the certutil user agent string, which there is one, or MSHTA or something. It really depends on your environment. For us, that doesn't really work in scale, so we tend to look for things that can't be modified and try to really hone in on that logic. So it was important to us to reflect based on how we've modified that and how we look for it. We do see a lot of groups renaming it, and there's examples now with the MITRE team linked to APT10 using it, a lot of APT32 and Fin7 as well.
Right.
So I think we'll talk a little bit about Fin7 in a few minutes.
Coming up here, yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty busy. And the last one that we added was execution guardrailing, which is basically an attacker, restricting execution, constraining execution of your payload based on attacker-specified environment-specific data. Not to split hairs too much, but it's sort of a different tier of sandbox evasion. It's not just trying to evade a sandbox or evading AV software or looking for its presence. It's something that could only be expected to exist in the target environment, in the victim environment. And
potentially the victim, either system or the victim environment. So that could be a very broad definition. So I think some of the, a good example would be the recent supply chain compromise that we talked about last time at ASIS, where they only ran on certain MAC addresses.
Restricting by MAC addresses.
Hyper-targeted, right?
And then the most common we see is Active Directory domain checks before launching, and there's some time-based stuff, but time-based restriction is not really environment specific. But there's all this category. Some of the coolest stuff that I've seen, and MITRE linked to, is from NCC Group, I think, that does a lot of it. And some of their work, like the Demiguy's HTA payload obfuscation framework that does some cool stuff, like looks for network attached devices, like looks for your local router's logo image size and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and I think I saw a POC of one where like they were like, if you want to target people who have this, internet service provider, they'll always have a default router, which then when you go to this IP address, which is the default gateway, serves up this specific image. So you can get hyper targeted or make it fairly generic and kind of simple.
Yeah. So there's a lot there, a lot we're trying to do there from a defensive perspective. That's kind of interesting and cool to see that added. So yeah, that's about all I have on attack this month. Hopefully we'll get some more stuff added. Last episode we talked about some of the Triton attacker TTPs and some gaps there. So again, it's a community-driven thing at this point, and so we'll all keep contributing.
That'd be great. So we had a series that we released we called CARBANAK Week. Little shout out to Shark Week there, where we basically had a series of blog posts that Tom Bennett and Mike Bailey helped author based on their analysis.
Yeah, it was a week-long exploration of the CARBANAK source code. And for longtime viewers of the show, they might remember, like 9 months ago?
I think so.
Yeah.
So background is we found it on VirusTotal, and by we, I mean actually this guy.
Oh, hey.
How did you find it? What were you doing that figured out that somebody uploaded it?
Yeah, I was surprised at people's interest in how it was found and celebration of that, because it was very not interesting, in my opinion. But
was it at like 1 a.m. like you normally do, like working late at night?
Yeah, about with Barry Vengerick on our team as well. Just, when you're responding to a lot of Fin7 intrusions and a lot of Fin group intrusions, you get, we said it before, like you start to really understand the attacker and the people issuing commands on the other side, and you can see if you think someone maybe makes a mistake or deploys something they didn't intend to. And it was just a couple files that we hadn't necessarily seen before, and Barry and I have been at it for a while. I think he was the Intel support on the first Fin7 engagement, and I led the first Fin7 engagement that Mandiant did. So yes, it was some files we didn't expect to see, and finding it was a matter of literally like searching for these thousands of files at a pretty regular interval. It was just a bunch of manual effort.
Right.
Following up something that seemed a little bit suspicious and we didn't expect to be there, and then identifying.
And then what was it that we found for the audience? Yeah,
a particular file that is dropped by one of Fin7's tools that was in this, was a small little artifact, just like a random artifact.
But it was in like a 20 meg package of like broader.
And so it was a part of a larger archive, and that archive contained, the source code for CARBANAK. And it was, I guess,
well, for which part? Like.
Yeah, so there's, we explore a lot of it in the blog and talk about what all that was found, and the compiled binaries. There's an archive full of those, as well as what was found is like a snapshot in time from a financial attacker's system where they were developing and working on this. So all kinds of plugins, all kinds of CARBANAK work in the middle of it being worked on.
And so what could you do with it if somebody got a hold of it, or like?
Oh, so that was interesting. I think as this came out, there was another thing that people focused on, which was why differing opinions about FireEye releasing the source code or linking to it.
Should we or shouldn't we have?
Yeah, because there's both sides where people discussed both sides. One side saying, wow, FireEye sat on this for 2 years and should have shared it with people. And the other side that says, you're almost equal number of people, like you're enabling attackers by releasing this. Right. So the interesting point there would be, we go through like an equities review process for everything. And again, we had the Flare guys on here 9 months ago to talk about it. We put it out there. We shared it with global law enforcement agencies and security companies. There were some antivirus vendor evasions in there, so we worked with those companies
to make sure they got fixed prior to release.
And so when we put out slides and a presentation, Mike and Tom did. So anyone that reached out to us, we provided all those files to them. We tried to do due diligence there, and one of the interesting things is if you actually tried to run it, which our Flare guys learned and lived through, it was not easy. There was a bunch of errors in compiling it because it was just in a snapshot of time.
Right. It was under active development, so you would have to deeply understand the source code, which, if you read the blogs, was incredibly difficult to even if you had the source code to follow and to understand and comprehend. In some cases, looking at the compiled binaries of actual CARBANAK made it or easier to analyze certain parts. So you have to know like where it was breaking, compile, and why. Which we spent, I don't know, was it 500 hours or 1,000 hours, in reversing the
I think a lot of the hours were on reversing the compiled binaries, and then the whole blog was interesting because it showed both sides. And I really recommend checking that out. I think in part 2 they talked about one part is written by Tom, who was looking at the compiled binaries, and the other part was written by Mike, who was looking at the source code, and seeing how accurate those reverse engineering identifications were and maybe why they were occurring. So the whole blog was kind of cool, but it was definitely a surprising and interesting and differed reaction to it. So we'll continue to always learn from that and try to do our best out there. But those source code archives are out there now where people can look through them. My takeaway on that, on introducing risk front, is that Fin7, for example, moved away from CARBANAK for a reason, and it would be really surprising for someone to start adopting it or adopting portions of the source code that's very difficult to understand when there's so much now publicly available.
Right, other tools that are much easier and simpler to use.
Yeah, and Fin7 did the same thing. Fin7 moved from that, and they moved to MITRE, TinyMet implementation. So, do we want to talk a little bit about Fin7?
Sure. Yeah, we've talked about in the show, so right after the indictments of some of the Fin7, I guess the 3 of the lead folks within the organization, the CEO, and then a couple of other guys, we didn't really know what would happen after that, but
within the blog we said
that
we expected the activity to continue since post-arrest we were still seeing them in the wild, but we didn't know what would happen when Department of Justice exposed the fact that they had a front company and stuff like that. Combi
Security was the front company in the original indictment, and Kaspersky released a blog since we've done our last show where they actually talked about, we've talked about Fin7 being active. They are. And they're operating under a new front company. The previous company was operating, I think they were headquartered in Israel, Ukraine, and Russia, and this new company is just in Russia. But kind of like the same playbook from before,
following
right?
What works for them.
Advertising, making it look like a legitimate security company, advertising on common places like LinkedIn and other places for, job postings, and trying to get vulnerability researchers who may or may not know who they're working for. It's a similar playbook, but just revamped, and Fin7 is definitely alive and well. Right over there. In this case, where they sent multiple, in this case, clean emails. I don't know if you want to go into a little bit how
how we talked a little bit about some of their document. I think we called it document profiling, but some of the trackers within documents on a past episode, like the document is only going to pull up and request a remote resource that lets the attackers know that it's been opened. That's kind of interesting from a psychological dynamic to know that your target is willing to open documents, and you get some other data perhaps like what kind of, which version of Office they're running depending on how they launch it. We had Alyssa on last episode if you want to get into the psychology behind getting phished. But that was an interesting thing that they've done. They've actually updated that a little bit. They're using this include picture way of launching it. It's Platinum was really one of the first groups that was doing that a long time ago. But they keep iterating and doing that. We've also found it interesting because those can also be deployed as decoy documents that are dropped. So like if this is a basically inert document, non-malicious document that drops and calls out, when you package it with your malicious document, you can know whether or not that decoy worked. It's just another way of tracking how effective, how efficient was this campaign. And we released some additional intelligence to our Intel portal subscribers about some of the other kind of cool things they're doing. One I did want to highlight was they are sending emails to victims, basically forwarding them. They're receiving these phishing emails as BCCs.
Or the victims receiving it.
Yes, they're all BCC.
Right, the user's BCC'd on the email, so they don't see who else it was sent to or not. Yeah,
so it's interesting maybe from an outbound perspective, outbound filtering perspective, those are less likely to get caught than a lot of Gmail addresses sending a ton of different emails. That's neither here nor there. What was interesting was within there, like the email subject said it was forwarded, and below that was a conversation between a law firm that prepared, a
lawsuit against the
legal case against these a particular set of victims. So basically, you receive this email that appears to be, it says forward, and it's from me, this individual is phishing you, but beneath it, it was my lawyer has actually sent me, here I've prepared your documents.
And so from like a user's perspective, you may be more likely to, say you're...
There's enough different about it.
Right, say you're a store manager at insert whatever company or a retail chain, you interact and engage with consumers on a daily basis, and so you're more likely to then want or be motivated to open this because you're worried about some sort of a lawsuit against your organization or your store. And so, I think it shows kind of a creative aspect of understanding the victim and the victim's mentality and what kinds of things are going to elicit them to be more likely to open something. And clearly a lawsuit. In the past, we've seen Fin7 use, claimed users or clientele who had gotten sick and then was complaining about food poisoning or something else. So just kind of more along that theme of understand the victim and who you're targeting, and make something that would seem that they would deal with on a regular basis.
Yep, and just continuing to iterate it and improve. On the tracking note, just kind of a side note, on tracking who's opening and who's analyzing your things, it's interesting. Hexacorn just put out a little mini blog about weaponizing PDBs, using PDB paths to make remote connections out. That it was possible that OllyDebug, right,
yep,
it shows that connection out. And his theory, just poking around, was like, this could be a way that attackers could identify that your payload was being analyzed versus run. And those kinds of metrics and trackers are super powerful.
Right. So in this case, the technical details would be if you modified the PDB path of your compiled binary to be like //1.2.3.4/ something.
Yeah.
The system you're using to analyze the malware, if it has an internet connection, will attempt to make a call out over TCP 445 to that remote resource.
Yeah.
And so, depending on, your environmental setup of either your system or say your sandbox that might be trying to run something, that's a way that you could determine is this running in something that has some sort of analysis tools of a P file.
Yeah, so more of a hypothesis. This could be a thing, but I always love that stuff. It gets you thinking about maybe, who knows all the different ways people are parsing that out and pulling it. And certainly we run a variety of things in live sandboxes, and it's just interesting. So looking forward to seeing more of that stuff. And some of the guys on our team are doing some research on the PDB pathing and some of the cool analysis you can do there. So we hope to share that in the future. What else do we have to talk about? I know you put out a call for subject matter to talk about. I was just curious, to get feedback and see what people want to hear about. So I think viewer Chris Bing put in a request to talk a little bit about some of the targeted ransomware. I think you wanted to know about Robinhood infection vectors specifically and lateral movement.
Right. And so we've been doing investigations of multiple victims between our products and our services teams that have been targeted by the same threat actor.
And it's a theme that's gone cross-episode for us. We've talked a lot about targeted ransomware.
I think I've called it extortionware in the past, but
he's trying to make something stick.
The term hasn't really stuck. So how about enterprise ransomware? Maybe that'll stick.
Perfect. So we do track a lot of these groups, and for a lot of them, and this group specifically included within there, it's the message to people is making sure you're patched up on the latest web vulnerability du jour, or I guess what's the French for of the month, of the quarter. It's been going on for a while. I'll learn French. Yeah.
One day.
Specifically, yeah, no, I'm not. We've seen a lot of like the Sharepoint vulnerability, that CVE that came out 2 months ago.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot.
That's used a lot
by
and
lots of
chained,
different threat actors, right?
with uploading web shells. So people just kind of spray looking for this, upload web shells, and they go back later and scan for them to see where they have access.
And it feels more like a little like target of opportunity versus like target of, I don't know, intent. I don't know.
Yeah, and then there's some differences when you actually, do that exploitation versus scanning for it and then uploading your next thing, or uploading your web shell and then scanning for the existence of that web shell. There's a couple opportunities for handing that off to more targeted attackers. I do want to include in there several of the Oracle WebLogic exploits, which are big issues and have been continued to be exploited by a number of groups that then come in for targeted access and deploy ransomware. And it feels like 2018 was a lot of the strut stuff, or that's what a lot of people heard about in the news. If you just think of the impact of these things, that's constantly a concern, is people using that. That said, when it comes down to part 2 of Mr. Bing's question about lateral movement, most of these groups, when they're coming in and they're interactively deploying it, will just use Mimikatz to dump credentials.
ESET for the win.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's the most, it's not like...
It's interactive.
And this is it's an interactive actor who's taking and has a list of systems, using a tool like PsExec is the most common, and then deploying that and running that on a whole bunch of systems all at once.
So check this out. This was kind of cool. I don't think anyone's really talked about this part, but the fact that the ransomware, Robinhood in this case, unmapped network shares was pretty interesting. So wait, why is it unmapping network shares? That's the opposite of automatically spreading laterally.
Right.
So it has to be deployed in a way that's interactive like this. But the psychology behind it's really kind of cool. Like, you want to make sure that if my system's infected and Glier's system's infected, and we both share a network share, like a shared file server, if that gets encrypted kind of 2 times with both keys, actually decrypting it becomes a nightmare. So it's a really smart, then we can know what key is used on each system.
It's like a Russian nesting doll of encryption, right? You need 100 keys, and you got to apply them in the right order.
You got to have your business model work. So that,
and remember, the way that we talked about in past cases, the way that the ransomware as a service is evolving is the person who's developing the malware is different than the person deploying it.
Yeah.
And so it's in the person developing it. It's in their best interest to structure it in a way that would maximize the victim to actually be able to unlock their files, because if you get the MO that your ransomware that you built, you can't, if you pay the ransom, you can't get it back. Well, then people will stop paying, right? So that's the opposite of what you want. So
people
author.
People are probably beat down from some of you, maybe from the target. I never thought we'd be talking about ransomware. There's a while where I was like, we're not doing it. We're not doing these cases. I think everyone kind of felt that way.
I don't feel like
but
every
the targeted,
time now we talk about
targeted intrusions with it, there's a lot. So you even see Fin6. Switching using
again,
yet another ransomware framework, Megacortex. So
this makes it 3. So we've seen them use Ryuk, we've seen them use Goga, and now we've seen them use Megacortex.
Yep.
I kind of wonder, in terms of them switching it up, are they switching it up because? So here's what I've noticed from the media. When the media reports on these, because they inevitably get reported on, they report on the malware that's used, right?
Yep.
So I'm wondering, are they switching it up because they want to be less noticed, or there's less attention, so they every month or so keep switching up what they're using? Because
it's a little bit confusing. Yeah. I don't want to give too many attacker tips, but you would think you'd leverage PR around, negative PR for the victims, around people getting compromised and feeling like they have to pay. If you're going to use, say, Robinhood again, people might be more willing to use it, hearing that, when you don't use it, this
it has a reputation.
This is a big thing. Or you're going to get trolled from the attacker on Twitter or something. But yeah, so there's a lot of things, a lot of considerations there. It's interesting to see people iterate. And again, I think they're just doing what works. So we're sharing the news for what works.
Right.
But yeah, hopefully we can stop talking about targeted ransomware. And one thing in that area
it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon.
That concerns me. That's again why just let's reduce
we're probably getting 3 or 4 calls a week about it.
Yes.
Maybe more, from new victims. It's constantly happening, and there's been now a year plus where it's just been, at least for us, the there's some of it gets publicized, most of it doesn't, but it's just like a constant stream of, it happening.
Yes. And so that's actually my concern with, I don't know if we wanted to talk about Bluekeep at all. There's not that much. I mean, it's really cool. There's a great blog by Matt Bromley, who co-authored a blog post about some of the ways to identify the different POCs. But the Bluekeep.
The Bluekeep.
Yes, sure. That could be one. We'll save that off. We'll use that as a vulnerability name. Do you want to talk about what that is real quick? Because I'm actually worried that that's going to hit in some ridiculous way with targeted ransomware.
So Microsoft released details about a new vulnerability, and the concern with it is it could be wormable because it bypasses authentication on a remote desktop. Remote desktop, there's millions of systems exposed to the internet that have remote desktop exposed, and then once you get within an organization, almost most systems have it or have it running. So once you get into one system, you can quickly pivot from there, because you can bypass the authentication and pass shellcode to it. To whatever DLL you want, if successful, you could then wreak havoc with it. And there have been lots of POCs, lots of trolls, like the POCs that don't work. So far, I've seen POCs that blue screen systems.
Mostly, the publicly released ones are blue screen, showing they can crash, which is problematic.
It's a step towards having one that's reliable, right?
Yeah.
Exploits. It's common that on your path towards getting success. I think Eternal Blue, the reason how it got its name was Eternal Blue Screen was the joke until it became more formalized.
I haven't seen Eternal Blue used in a while, so.
Okay. So we haven't seen it exploited yet. We've seen lots of POCs. We're on the lookout for it, and just like everybody else is. So, patch your
we'll
RDP.
See. Hopefully, we're not talking about it on the next episode.
Yeah, I mean, but the reality is, like, at least from an incident response perspective, a lot of our stuff is backward looking, and so we may find something 1, 3, 5, 12 months from now, and then work it back. This actually kind of feels a little bit like Heartbleed, where when Heartbleed first came out, it was like, is it possible? Is it not? Can you use it? And it took us about a week from it coming out to actually have an IR engagement with it, which I'd led. And then, actually we had probably 4 or 5 different engagements over the course of the next 2 years, where we chained it back, and the day they got in was the exact same day, hitting VPN concentrators that were vulnerable to it. So
honestly,
I'm sure we'll probably
one's
see something
sort of
like this
impressive with the delay in
it must be really hard to
RCE
weaponize.
POCs coming out.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which says a little something about its use in the wild. So it's definitely very, very interesting. So did you want to talk a little bit about some of the APT34 tool leaks? I know you queued that up front.
Yeah. So so there was a persona on Twitter that reached out to lots of different security researchers, us included, and were claiming to have a bunch of, that they had broken into APT34 or oil rig, and they were going to dox them claiming that they had access to their tools. And what they pitched each security researcher was slightly different in terms of what's come out since. But amazingly, actually, for the InfoSec community, none of them bit. So the persona had to kind of pivot, and instead of releasing the tools publicly, they kind of...
I think they underestimated maybe how much people talk, right? So a lot of people were sharing, hey, I got a DM from this guy saying this, and the various messages from that original persona were really different and sort of intelligently tailored to each victim, or each recipient, researcher and company, to try to get them to talk about the thing, but all the stories didn't line up. So very quickly, it starts to look like, my opinion, an offensive foreign counterintelligence operation that's trying to get this message out no matter how they can. So in this case, though...
And leveraging the credibility of a security researcher to do it for them, none of them bit. So it looks like they kind of pivoted their strategy and then had to create a kind of fake security researcher persona, release a bunch of the tools online, and then try and draw attention to it. The tools, when you look at them, they're related to the DNS espionage attacks that we've talked about in previous episodes. I mean, they look legit, right? There's
just another one released right before we're
I think
doing this,
just a couple hours ago, there was a new one that is a Office 365 brute forcing tool, right? And all the tools, when you look at them, that would enable you to accomplish.
They're consistent with the non-public information we have around intrusions using them as well. There's a lot of those checks you do on the tools, so The tools
are likely legit. My guess, just from looking at like the tools and where they would be deployed, and then also the lack of tools, this group of personas now has claimed to then they kind of pivoted off the original story, and now they're part of like the Green Movement inside Iran, and supposedly they're like members that are actually members of 34. But it doesn't really seem to add up because the tools they have access to are only ones that you would deploy on like a hotpoint or an intermediate server.
Yeah.
And if you had access to real inside information, you'd have a lot more. So it feels like somebody got access to a hotpoint which had the tools deployed and then leveraged that data and access to then, want to try and.
From a technical perspective, it's very good, very interesting for defenders to look into it and explore it. And I would just encourage, I guess, everyone, as again, impressively, a lot of the reporters did in this case and other researchers, to question why it is you're receiving
question
this
the motives. Along that line, I mean, it's a different tactic, but the U.S. Cyber Command has recently, in the last 12 months, they've started an effort to, so what have the 34 leaks caused? I would assume it's caused 34 to then either potentially retool or have to do a bunch of work.
Yep.
U.S. Cyber Command has then also been releasing mostly APT28 samples, but to VirusTotal.
In the case of this other that might be a foreign counterintelligence operation, one of the takeaways, undoubtedly for 34, has been that their operations have been burned to some degree out in the public and out directly into the hands of researchers. So Cyber Command has done similar stuff, but in a much more
more transparent, or like there's no blog, there's no fanfare where they just like upload a sample to VirusTotal and then like call it out on a Twitter account they have, and they're like
with a pretty robust comment on what's used.
But I assume there's a similar goal or intention, which is highlight attacker tools, and then it's going to force the adversary or the threat actor kind of on the defensive so they have to think like, well where did this come from, or what infrastructure, or okay, so if they got to that, what else does that mean, or and you end up spending a lot of cycles, I would imagine, running that down or thinking, okay, well now maybe do I need to write new tools because this one has been doxed and
it's interesting. Maybe if we all can just take a break, we'll let them. I don't know if they do a pretty good job of filling the gap of like what people have talked about. Their samples they share are pretty unique and interesting for certain reasons. So I think it also shows they're paying attention to what people are providing in the threat intel space and blogging about to fill it out a little bit. So
my favorite is when the sample gets uploaded and there's like no detections on VirusTotal, and then like you watch it over like the days and it goes like one.
We're supposed to have one of the data science team members. We'll get them on an upcoming episode, talk about some of the VT gamesmanship and some questions people have about how a lot of that stuff works.
Right.
But the VT engine detection is definitely an interesting thing of its own. So, I mean, you should probably keep in mind that any platform could be used for counterintelligence operations as well. So take absolutely everything with a grain of salt. I happen to think what they've been providing is accurate, but there's also, who knows how anyone could use it. So just doing your own independent verification of all of the data makes a lot of sense. But in the terms of governments burning operations or governments talking about operations, there was yet another indictment.
Sure.
This is the last year has been
there's been a string of them specifically focused on like Chinese. So there's a new indictment that named the victim that was Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, as well as 3 different other unnamed in other industries, being targeted by 2 Chinese individuals. One was named, one was not named, and then goes into a lot of detail of specifically what they did.
This was a little bit close to home for you.
It was close to home. I spent a lot of time. I led the technical investigation of Anthem, so I'm not going to go into too many details there, but it was a topic that was near and dear to my heart. But what I will say is this indictment is a little different than some of the other ones. So there have been a couple now. So APT3 was indicted, or at least members that we associate with APT3 were indicted related to a private company. So in the indictment, they called out the company they worked for called Boyusek. It didn't call out in the indictment APT3, but mentioned the company. The APT10 indictment, I saw actually then named them by name, also named the private company that they had spun up, as well as the MSS organization that they worked for. So each one has a little bit like different like level of information, whereas the most recent indictment that names Anthem as the victim specified 2 individuals, but no APT group that they're associated with, as well as no state-sponsored group that they're working for. So I thought that kind of the lack of information was interesting or notable.
So talk about that, like from I know when people go through, when people are going through this, or your personal experience with this group responding multiple places, you have where the victims want to know who it is, or the,
right.
Us as responders, we have an idea of who it is, and that would be helpful for the general public to know, and the delay between,
right.
An indictment now naming a victim, which is interesting. So a victim-based indictment about who was behind it and who they may have been tied to.
So sometimes when we do investigations, we know instantly who the threat actor is, right? And other times we're like, well, we're not really sure, but we've seen them before, but, we think we know their motivation, or we think we know who might be involved, right? And so depending on our level of comfort and confidence, that ranges on every investigation. But, the victim, any victim you work with, the first question they have is like, who was it, and why were they here, and what were they targeting? And it's just a general observation of mine. Like, I think it's interesting to see these indictments coming out now. They feel a little bit late to the game in that many of these companies who, when they get breached, they get class action lawsuits. Everyone assumes the worst, and especially from a PI perspective, assumes that their data was taken, and now like, I got my identity stolen, and so.
Let's make it more as a much more broad statement. This happens like all the time,
right?
And a bunch of the public, the publicly disclosed breaches have similar issues or similar optics problems around Marriott and Equifax and stuff like that for how that data is used, and everyone has to assume, as customers of them or people implicated in that breach. People are sort of mobilized and concerned about how their data will be used, or assume that it'll be financially motivated. I know on several investigations that I've led, immediately you get in some of the accounting firms that are doing various audits, sort of without anyone having specified who the group was behind it and what they were using the data for. So not that it's I'm speaking very vaguely, I guess. But there's banks and card brands that immediately get involved, that are concerned that people's data is being used for financial crime. And meanwhile, as investigators and with our intelligence apparatus, we might know
who it is,
other thing
what
entirely.
The motivation is, right? And the frustrating part is, as the investigator or even the victim potentially, it would be helpful, whatever government you work for, if you're watching, to come out and make some sort of statement, or potentially to help the victim, because if depending on who's behind it, that materially impacts like what you can do with it or what they're likely to do with it. And
it's not reducing blame or risk, because we're not saying it's not still a big deal, but there are other subsets of organizations that should be more concerned. For example, if you hold a government clearance and your data was taken in a certain breach, that might be of more concern, and you might need to take more preventative measures than the broader public that's worried about financial crime with that same information. So
all right, well, that's about all I have to say about that, but I wanted to at least talk about it and mention what we can and about the topic.
So I'm trying to think if there was anything else that you queued up front that we were going to hit on. We've released a couple blog posts recently. Some threat research blogs. There's a lot of really awesome other research too that I kind of want to hit on real quick as we close out. But anything on the blogs that we've put up recently? Some continued disinformation campaigns.
Yeah, so we had a new one where we talked about another, and this is like a new like type of attack, right? Like this isn't going to go away anytime soon. They're going to morph. They're going to change. And I think this one was interesting.
All right, so I'll stop.
All right, where foreign governments are going to try and modify political discourse in other countries, the U.S., France, Western, but also Asian, all around the world. And this one I think was notable in that the Iran or Iran-linked or backed or I guess interested parties were. In some of the previous ones, had been more just like trying to get like social media chatter, and this one I thought some of the interesting ones were they were actually like trying to either engage with journalists, to try and get journalists to then ask certain questions or to sway them in a particular way, or they were actually impersonating people running for Congress in the previous election, that the persona that they had taken on was that Congress person. So just a couple different interesting changes in tactics. Maybe test out, see different things that might be effective, or I would expect to see kind of a continually evolving set of things here from various nation state actors.
If you want to check out the blog on some of that continued Iranian disinformation campaign stuff, it's interesting. Broadly, it's like people have called it the post-truth era, and I feel for people. I feel for journalists that are writing on a number of things we discussed even in this episode, where it's really hard to get the ground truth, and it's one of the nice things about working in positions like we have. Like, there is a ground truth. There's something you're driving towards, and whether it's our intel team exposing some of the disinformation and inauthentic accounts, or as incident responders surfacing up what an initial infection vector, how people do lateral movement, how something was done is like a really cool part about working in the field. And what people choose to do with that information, and who gets that information, is dictated by relationships we have and contracts where we share that information. What they choose to do with it is sort of up to them, or up to the court of public opinion on how they route it and the legal requirements around it. But it's nice in an increasingly noisy world to have some insight into what happened and provide that. With that said, I want to there's a couple other really cool blog posts. Some we put out, a couple others out there in the community that we were big fans of and wanted to talk about more this time. One, the string sifter tool, our blog post about some ML models we created. I know we're gonna bring our data scientists on for any doubters.
Well, it's a prep for next time.
Yeah, exactly. About talking about identifying globally unique or globally interesting strings, and some ways we've approached this problem. Just adding a layer upon really what I say is the most basic version of analyzing files.
Right.
And then so that's pretty cool. There's some really great external research. The SAS conference is starting to post its videos on YouTube, and I was pretty happy. I think FireEye had like 8 total presenters. It was like the second most, second to Kaspersky. There's some really cool FireEye presentations that'll be out there, but some really great other presentations as well, like really awesome stuff. So if you haven't checked out things like the Chronicle's research on Gossip Girl and the concept of supragroups and groups coming together to accomplish a certain mission that cross traditional lines of attribution, that's pretty neat. We've talked some about the difficulty of separating who's developed a tool from who's deploying a tool, and even with things like the hacking team and how threat intel tracks these different groups, it gets really interesting. That's awesome. Our own Steve Miller on our team, he presented about definitely not hacking back. So his individual research, definitely check that out, about streaming unexpected byte sequences back to attacker C2.
Yep.
And just talk, like, the broad takeaway there is, like, there's proprietary or custom binary protocols used by these different backdoors.
There's potential risks to bad guys implementing and using those.
Yes. Right? So, if you're using an HTTP-based backdoor, it's going to be a little bit more stable, like the protocol. If you're using your own thing, it opens you up to other stuff going on. It's actually a concept that, like, Richard Baitlich and others have talked about for a while and have issued different things on. And Steve took it a little bit further with showing how you can basically stream back unexpected data and cause different ramifications on the attacker system. So that was neat. The Taj Mahal presentation, that's definitely worth checking out. That's crazy. And then, more broadly, there's just I feel like a lot of really good stuff coming out of a lot of places. ESET's Light Neuron report is great. And there's so much I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep up with. It's cool to work in a field that's exciting, where we're moving this fast. We hope to break it down from what we're seeing on the front lines.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next Day of the Hack.
Cheers.
Cheers.